Red Riding Hood, The Blood Trail. Prologue. The Dark Forest. The forest was a dark and unwelcoming place, where even daylight seemed cold and alien. Twisted, gnarled trees reached toward the sky, their knotted branches stretching out as if in desperate supplication. Few dared to walk these paths anymore. They said the forest was cursed, that something terrible lived deep within, taking the lives of those who ventured too close. But the forest hadn't always been like this. Once, children played here, laughing on sunlit meadows, gathering berries. But those days were long gone. Now, anyone who approached felt a chill that seeped into their very soul, filling them with an inexplicable dread. The elders in the village whispered that the forest itself was alive, driving people away with its malevolent will. Yet, no one knew the whole truth. No one knew that the source of this evil wasn't just an ancient curse. It was hidden in a little girl whose innocent eyes and angelic face could deceive anyone. Red Riding Hood. The girl who once captivated everyone had become the greatest threat to all who crossed her path. The elders whispered that her red cloak was not just clothing, but a symbol of the blood she had spilled. That she was no longer the naive child who once set out to visit her grandmother. Now she was the embodiment of the darkness that dwelled deep within her soul, spreading fear to all who encountered her. The forest kept her secret, concealing her deeds under the cover of night. The wind carried rumors to the village of missing travelers, of beasts that never returned from the forest, and the villagers silently bolted their doors and windows at night, fearing what might come from the darkness. But there was one person, a hunter, who knew the truth. He alone dared to track her, knowing that this hunt would be his most dangerous. He did not know whether he could stop Red Riding Hood, or if he would become her next victim. But one thing was certain. The forest would never be the same as long as she inhabited it. The darkness deepened, and the forest lived on, hiding within its depths a terror that no one dared speak of aloud. But soon, everything would change. Very soon. Chapter 1. The Red Trail. The mist clung low to the ground, wrapping the forest in a gray shroud as if concealing something that should never be seen. The forest was silent, as if it had held its breath, sensing the approach of something ominous. In this mist, among the ancient, decaying trees, a figure in a red cloak moved slowly. Red Riding Hood stepped lightly, her feet barely touching the ground, her steps silent, and her eyes fixed ahead with grim determination. Her cloak billowed behind her, hiding her slender but strong figure. In her hands, she carried a basket, heavy with something dark, thick liquid seeping from beneath its lid. Each of her movements was filled with calm, cold-blooded confidence, foretelling nothing good. She walked along a narrow path that she herself had once carved through the wild undergrowth. This path was now stained red, the blood of countless victims who had dared to stand in her way. Once, this road led to her grandmother's house, but now it had become a symbol of fear and death. Red Riding Hood could feel the forest living with her, the darkness bending to her will. She was no longer the ordinary girl, frightened by wolves and other dangers. Now, she was the danger that even the beasts feared. The wolves, who once hunted in this forest, now rarely ventured into its depths, sensing the scent of death and danger in the air. Her eyes were fixed on the forest ahead, where a figure lurked in the shadows. This was no mere traveler lost in these parts. Red Riding Hood knew it was the hunter who had dared to track her. He thought he could catch her, stop her, but he had no idea that he had already fallen into her trap. Red Riding Hood did not quicken her pace. Her movements were deliberate, but every thought was focused on the upcoming encounter. She was not afraid. On the contrary, a flicker of anticipation burned within her. This time, she would not be playing with a wolf, but with a man. The hunt promised to be interesting. The hunter did not know that his prey was far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. And when they met, he would realize it far too late. Red Riding Hood continued forward, and the mist parted before her, revealing the blood-stained trail that led her to her next victim. She approached the place where the hunter was hiding and smiled. Her smile was icy, full of silent promise. This forest was hers, and she would not allow anyone to challenge her and live. Soon, night would fall, and with it, the end would come for those who dared to stand in her way. Chapter 2: The Encounter with the Wolf. Night was slowly descending upon the forest, enveloping it in a dark veil. The forest, usually full of life, was strangely silent. No rustling, no snapping of twigs, no whispers of the wind. Only the heavy breathing of a shadow moving among the trees betrayed the presence of someone else. Red Riding Hood moved confidently, without fear, as if the darkness was her home. Her crimson cloak stood out in the night, like a blood stain on black fabric, its edges fluttering with the occasional gusts of wind. She knew she was not alone in this forest. The wolf was here, and she could feel his presence. She knew he was watching her, hiding in the shadows, hesitating to attack. But she was not afraid, because this was her game, and she made the rules. The wolf waited. He was old and experienced, a hunter whose instincts told him something was wrong. This girl was different from the others. Her scent was strange, mixed with something metallic and heavy, reminding him of the scent of blood. He didn't know where this feeling came from, but every fiber of his being told him this hunt would be different. Red Riding Hood stopped in a clearing bathed in moonlight. She stood in the center of the glade and slowly, almost imperceptibly, smiled. The tension hung in the air like before a storm. The wolf knew this was his chance, his moment. If he didn't strike now, he might miss his prey. He took a step forward, making a faint rustle. The girl turned her head toward him, her gaze meeting his yellow eyes. For a moment, they were locked in place, studying each other. In that moment, the wolf realized he had made a mistake. This girl did not fear him. Her gaze was not filled with terror, but something else, something dark and dangerous. In her eyes burned a fire that told him she was not only unafraid, but had been waiting for this moment. She took a step forward, slowly drawing her hand from beneath her cloak. In her small hand gleamed the blade of a knife, thin as a moonbeam. The wolf growled, but it was more of a panic than a threat. He felt that this time he was not the hunter, but the prey. But he still hoped he could defeat her. Red Riding Hood didn't give him time to think. She lunged forward, fast and agile like a shadow. The wolf was stunned by her speed and ferocity. They clashed in a fierce struggle where there was no room for mercy or pity. She struck blow after blow, precise and deadly, forcing the wolf to retreat. He knew he was losing. Every strike of hers was filled with strength that belied her appearance. She was a swift, deadly hurricane, sweeping away everything in her path. The wolf realized that this girl was far from defenseless. She was a monster hidden beneath a mask of innocence. The final blow from Red Riding Hood was decisive. Her knife sank deep into the wolf's side, and with a final guttural growl, he collapsed to the ground. The girl stood over his lifeless body, her chest heaving from the recent fight, but her face showed no fear, no joy, only cold satisfaction from a job well done. She wiped the blade on his fur and hid the knife beneath her cloak. Her gaze turned forward again, toward the depths of the forest. In this battle, the wolf was just another victim on her bloody trail, and the hunter following her would soon learn that this trail showed no mercy. With a chilling calm, Red Riding Hood resumed her path, leaving behind another dead soul in the dark forest. Chapter 3. Grandmother's Secret. The grandmother's cottage stood at the very edge of the forest, hidden among the trees as if trying to escape the world. Small, with a sagging roof and windows boarded up from the inside, it seemed forgotten and abandoned. But for those who knew its inhabitant, this place was much more than just a house. It held many secrets, cloaked in darkness and fear. Red Riding Hood stepped up to the door, her heart beating evenly and calmly, like a hunter before a shot. She knew her grandmother was waiting for her, as she always did. But now their meetings were different. They were no longer accompanied by the joy and anticipation of childhood. Now it was more of a ritual, an inevitable part of her life that bound them both with dark ties. The door opened silently, as if the grandmother knew she was coming. Inside, it was dark, with only a lone candle dimly lighting the small room, the smell of herbs and dried mushrooms mixed with something metallic, reminiscent of old blood. "Come in, dear," came the trembling but still strong voice of the grandmother from the depths of the house. Red Riding Hood entered without removing her hood. Her gaze met her grandmother's, filled with hidden strength and wisdom accumulated over the years. The grandmother sat in a chair by the fireplace, her thin hands resting on the armrests, and her eyes seemed to peer straight into the soul. "Yep, you've brought me something interesting again, haven't you?" the old woman said, her lips curling into a faint smile. Red Riding Hood approached closer, removing her hood to reveal her face. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light, but there was no trace of the warmth that once filled this room. "Yes, grandmother," she replied softly, pulling something heavy and wrapped in cloth from her basket. The old woman extended a trembling hand, and Red Riding Hood carefully placed the object into her palm. The cloth unfolded, revealing the head of the wolf, still warm, with blood-soaked fur and bared teeth. The grandmother examined it and then nodded, as if confirming something. "He was strong," the girl said, "but I handled it." "You're becoming stronger." The grandmother nodded approvingly, raising her eyes to her granddaughter. "That's good, but remember, strength can also be a curse." Red Riding Hood simply nodded silently. Her grandmother had always been wise and mysterious, keeping knowledge that she passed on to her granddaughter, preparing her for what was to come. But the girl felt that there was something more hidden in this house, something the grandmother had never spoken of. "You're not ready to know everything yet," the old woman said, as if reading her thoughts, her voice tinged with sternness. "But the time will come soon, and then you must be prepared." Even Red Riding Hood looked at her grandmother without asking questions. She knew that one day all the secrets would be revealed, but she also knew that until then, she had her task to complete. To destroy those who dared to stand in her way and make the forest a place where no one would dare challenge her. The grandmother averted her gaze and stared once again at the fire burning in the hearth. "Go, my child," she said, her voice softening once more. "You have much work ahead of you. Remember, this forest is yours, but you must be careful. There are always those who will seek to challenge you." Red Riding Hood nodded and silently left the house, leaving her grandmother alone with her thoughts and the secrets she was not yet ready to reveal. The forest greeted her with the same cold wind and silence, but now a fire burned in her heart. She knew there were still many trials ahead, but she was ready for them. After all, her grandmother had taught her well, and the most important lesson was to trust no one but herself. Chapter 4. The Hunter in the Forest. The forest seemed silent, but the hunter knew this silence was deceptive. The twigs beneath his feet cracked too loudly, and every step seemed to echo through the entire woods. He moved cautiously, hiding behind trees, avoiding open spaces where he could be seen. Yet he knew that someone was already watching him. The hunter was experienced. He had traversed many forests, faced dangers most people could not even imagine. But this forest was different. It felt alive, ancient, and malevolent, as if it was toying with him, watching his every move. He had heard the stories. The elders in the village spoke of a curse, of vanished travelers, and horrific creatures lurking in the shadows. But the hunter hadn't come for tales. He had come for the one known as Red Riding Hood. They said she was just a girl, but the tales about her were filled with a terror that couldn't be explained by mere childish cruelty. He had found the tracks, barely noticeable imprints on the soft ground, slightly crushed blades of grass. Everything pointed to her being nearby. But these tracks also told him she knew she was being followed. The hunter felt more like prey than a predator, being led along a path straight into a trap. His hand gripped the handle of the knife hidden in his jacket pocket. He was ready for a fight, but deep down, he knew his opponent was no ordinary one. He had faced predators before, but this girl, if she truly was what they said, was more dangerous than any beast. The darkness deepened, and as the hunter moved forward, he felt the tension mounting. The forest around him seemed to come alive. Somewhere ahead, a rustle. A shadow flitted through the bushes. The hunter froze, listening to the sounds. He knew she was close. Perhaps even now she was watching him, waiting for the right moment. He moved forward even more cautiously this time, trying not to give away his position. His eyes scanned every corner, every bush, every tree. But the forest was treacherous. Shadows played tricks on his mind, and he could no longer be sure of what he was seeing. Suddenly, ahead in the dense underbrush, a flash of crimson caught his eye. It was her cloak, red as blood, standing out among the greenery and grayness of the forest. The hunter tensed, slowly advancing. He knew it could be a trap, but he couldn't miss the opportunity. He carefully approached, trying to remain silent. The cloak hung still, as if someone had simply draped it over a branch. The hunter took another step and froze, feeling his heart beat faster. He reached out to the cloak, but suddenly heard a slight crack of a twig behind him. He spun around sharply, ready for an attack, but saw nothing. The forest had returned to its silence, but the hunter knew she was there, close by, watching him. He drew his knife, his hands ready for battle, but something in the air made him pause. A chill ran down his spine, and at that moment, he realized he had walked into a trap. From the shadows, a figure slowly emerged. Red Riding Hood. She stood directly in front of him, her face hidden beneath her hood, but the hunter, knew her eyes were boring into him. The girl slowly raised her head, and he saw something in her eyes that he did not expect. Not fear, not glee, but rather regret, as if she knew this outcome was inevitable. "You came for me?" Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it held such power that the hunter understood. He would not leave this forest alive. He prepared for battle, knowing there was no other choice. But the girl did not rush to attack. She seemed to savor the moment, studying him like a beast playing with its prey. "You're not the first to try to stop me," she continued, her voice calm, though now tinged with coldness. "And you won't be the last. But everyone who comes here thinks they can win. It's foolish." The hunter said nothing. He knew that words now meant nothing, but in her eyes, there was something more than just a thirst for blood. There was something he could not understand, but felt in every nerve. "You don't understand what's really happening," she said, her voice growing colder. "This forest belongs to me. And now, so do you." In the next instant, she vanished. Simply dissolved into the shadows, leaving the hunter alone with his knife in hand and a terrible realization that the game had only just begun. The forest stood still, but now he felt it surrounding him with something more than just trees and shadows. He was a stranger here, in a world governed not by the laws of nature, but by the will of this little girl. And he knew that now he had only one choice: fight or die. But deep down, the hunter understood that this forest had already made the decision for him. Chapter 5. The Bloody Feast. Night had swallowed the forest, and the moon, hanging high in the sky, bathed it in a grim silver light. The forest breathed heavily, as if in anticipation of what was to come. Red Riding Hood walked along her path, her cloak billowing behind her like a blood-red banner. In her hands was a basket, but this time its contents were far more sinister than mere bread or wine. She knew the hunter was following her, knew every step he took. But now, she herself was leading him to the place where all secrets would be revealed. Deep in the forest, beyond an old cemetery, lay a place that even the most daring of villagers avoided. There, in the ruins of an ancient monastery, dwelled a darkness so ancient and deep that even the trees seemed to feel it. Red Riding Hood stopped at a crumbling archway, covered in moss and tangled vines. She knew the hunter was nearby, that he could see her. But it didn't matter now. She knew everything was going according to plan. In this place, where prayers were once offered, only evil reigned. Here, she could be herself without the mask of an innocent girl. She entered the ruins, feeling the cold stones beneath her feet, transmitting ancient stories of pain and suffering. In the center of the monastery stood a stone altar, once used for sacrifices. Now it was desecrated, soaked with the blood of her enemies. Red Riding Hood approached the altar and slowly laid out the contents of the basket. The hunter, hidden in the shadows, watched her. He saw her place the heads of those who had dared challenge her onto the altar. The wolf was among them, his eyes still wide open, forever frozen in terror. The hunter gripped his knife tighter. He had seen enough. It was time to act. But every instinct screamed danger. Every nerve was stretched taut. He knew time was running out, and if he didn't make the first move, he would soon become one of those victims. But Red Riding Hood seemed to know he was there. She slowly turned her head, her eyes glinting in the moonlight like two cold flames. She knew he had come, and she had been waiting for this moment. "You thought you could stop me." Her voice echoed through the ruins, bouncing off the stone walls. "You thought your determination and strength would save you? But you never understood what you were dealing with." The hunter stepped forward, leaving his cover. He could no longer stay in the shadows, could no longer let this girl continue her bloody games. But in her eyes, he saw something unexpected. Not fear, not gloating. More like sorrow, as if she knew this outcome was inevitable. "You came here to die," she said softly, but her voice was filled with resolve. "This forest is mine now. I am its keeper, and no one can disturb its peace." She took a step back, and the altar behind her began to glow with a red light. The stones seemed to come alive, filled with an energy they had absorbed over centuries. The hunter felt a chill grip his body, as if death itself had touched him with icy fingers. He lunged forward, his knife aimed straight at the girl's heart. But just as his blade was about to meet her flesh, something stopped him. A wild, unbearable howl erupted around him, as if all the souls lost in this forest screamed in unison. The wind rose, howling through the ruins, and the darkness thickened around the altar. Red Riding Hood raised her hand, and the hunter froze in place, his body paralyzed by an invisible force. She looked at him, and in her eyes was an ancient wisdom he could not comprehend. She knew his end was near, but in her heart there was no joy. "I didn't want this," she whispered, her words lost in the chaos swirling around them. "But this is my fate. This forest needs me, and I cannot allow you or anyone else to disrupt its peace." With those words, she released the hunter, and his body collapsed to the ground. He tried to rise, but his strength was slipping away like water through his fingers. All he could do was watch as Red Riding Hood stepped toward the altar and raised her arms, calling upon forces far older than herself. The altar blazed with a blood-red light, and from the earth rose the roots of trees surrounding the hunter. They pierced his body, rending flesh and bone. The pain was excruciating, but in his heart there was only one feeling: despair. He knew he had lost. This forest, this ancient horror, would forever remain under her control. Red Riding Hood stood over him, her face hidden in the shadow of her hood, but he saw in her eyes something human, something that told him she was still the little girl she had once been. But that was only an illusion. She no longer belonged to the world of men. With his final breath, the hunter saw the darkness engulf everything around him, and his consciousness faded, leaving only emptiness. The forest grew silent once more, but now that silence was different. It was absolute, like death, with no room for hope. Red Riding Hood slowly lowered her arms, and the light from the altar dimmed. She knew it was over. This forest, her forest, was protected. But in her heart, a weight remained, one she could not shake off. She knew she had once been different, but now she was part of this forest, its guardian, its curse. She turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the altar behind, drenched in the blood of those who had tried to challenge her. The forest stood still once more, and the night returned to its calm, as if nothing had happened. But for those who knew the truth, this forest was no longer just a forest. It was a place where evil had found its refuge, where no one could be safe. Chapter 6. The End of Innocence. Forest stood in its eternal silence, but now it was not just silence. It was an absolute stillness, suffused with the sense of something sinister. The wind no longer stirred the leaves, and even the animals that once inhabited the woods seemed to have fled. The forest belonged to her now, and it had become a reflection of her soul. Dark, silent, and merciless. Red Riding Hood walked along her trail, leaving footprints in the soft earth. Her crimson cloak was no longer as bright as it once was, but now it was even more symbolic. Soaked in blood, it served as a reminder of those who had fallen on her path. The girl no longer felt fear or doubt. She knew what she had become and accepted her fate. Ahead, at the edge of the trail, stood the old, half-abandoned cottage. Grandmother's cottage. The place where her life had once been simple and carefree, where she had been just a little girl on her way to visit her grandmother. But those days were long gone. Now she came here with a different purpose. Grandmother was waiting for her on the threshold, her eyes filled with sadness and understanding. She knew this moment would come. She had seen her little girl transform into something more than human, into something that belonged to this forest and its ancient secrets. "You've made your choice," the grandmother said, her voice full of bitterness, but there was pride in it as well. "You are now the keeper of this forest. But remember, the power you've gained comes with loneliness. You can no longer be part of this world." Red Riding Hood stopped before her grandmother, her eyes shining in the dim light. She knew her grandmother was right. Her path had ended, but this end was just the beginning of a new life. A life where she was not just a girl, but something much older and more powerful. "I know, grandmother," she replied quietly, "but this is the only path I can take. I must protect this forest, as you protected it before me." The old woman nodded, and a tear glistened in her eye. She knew that they would never be the same again. Her granddaughter was gone, and in her place was only a shadow of who she once had been. "Goodbye, my child," the grandmother whispered, her voice trembling. "This forest is yours now, but know that it will not bring you peace." Red Riding Hood slowly approached her grandmother and embraced her. It was the last moment of warmth and humanity she could allow herself. Then she stepped back, her face once again calm and cold. She turned and walked away, leaving her grandmother on the threshold of her old home. The forest greeted her with its usual chill and silence, but now she did not feel alone. The forest was her home, her kingdom, and she was ready to rule it forever. Each step echoed in the void, and Red Riding Hood knew her life would never be the same. But she accepted that. She knew her fate had been predestined. She had become what she was meant to be, and now all that remained was to walk forward, along her path, among the dark trees, forever guarding this forest from those who dared to challenge her. And so, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only the legend of Red Riding Hood, the little girl who became the embodiment of evil, protecting the forest from all who dared disturb it. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.